Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today, Improving Cyber Resilience of Critical Infrastructure Providers. Our guest speaker today is former director at the National Cybersecurity Center, John Noble. We're super excited to have him here with us today. You're also joined by BeyondTrust Brian Chappell, Senior Director, Solutions Architect, who will cover a few points about BeyondTrust after John's portion, so please stick around for that. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today. Hello, everybody. A couple housekeeping items first. A reminder that all attendee lines are muted, but in an effort to keep this session interactive, we invite you to submit your questions live through the GoToWebinar console. And if we have time left at the end, we'll jump into our live Q&A. Also, today's session is being recorded. You'll receive a follow-up email containing links to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 to 2 business days from now. The slides can also be immediately downloaded via the handout section in the GoToWebinar console. Additionally, if you are attending for CPE credits with ISACA, you must download the attendance verification document in the handout section now in order to submit proof that you attended today's session. Okay, so now that that's all out of the way, let's hand it on over to John Noble, who will jump right in. John, welcome. Thank you for being here today with BeyondTrust, and take it away. Hello.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much, BeyondTrust, and of course, thank you to everybody who's given up time to listen and join this this webinar. What I am conscious of, looking through the list of attendees, there's people from all over the world. So perhaps it might be helpful if I gave just a little bit of context about my background, and in particular about the National Cybersecurity Center, which, as Sarah flagged, I was one of the directors at up until a few months ago. So for those of you from overseas, the NCSC was formed in 2016 by the UK government, and it brought together all the different bits of government that dealt with cyber, including the various CERT functions. So if you're in the United States, it would be the equivalent of bringing together those parts of DHS who dealt with cyber and those parts of the FBI, and then placing them under NSA, because NCSC is part of GCHQ, which is the Signals Intelligence Organization in the UK. And the objective of bringing everybody together was to create a joined up response to cyber threats. And in effect, the NCSC does 4 things. So I'm going to try and cover those 4 things as we go through. And the first one, and I hope which is going to be of particular interest today, it has a role to understand the threat, understand who the threat actors are and what their tactics, techniques, and procedures, the TTP to use the jargon, are. The second bit is about working with government and industry and sharing that threat information. Thirdly, around building capacity, the people and technology that you need as a country to make you successful in the digital age. And finally, the part that I led, which was around incident management. And in my time at the NCSC, we ran just over 800 serious incidents. And it's around those incidents that I want to go and share some of the key themes today. I want to talk about what we saw and what were the most important lessons that we can draw from for critical infrastructure providers. I expect I'll take about 30 to 35 minutes to do that. And I'm going to try and do it in 2 ways. So I'm going to start with a couple of case studies. And then secondly, I'm going to look at the reasons why organizations end up being compromised. But let's start by focusing on the threat to critical infrastructure providers. And the first point I want to make is that what we saw in the NCSC is that whilst traditional state cyber activity is still very much focused on government as the target, government and its supply chain, there's been a real shift over the last couple of years towards the targeting of critical infrastructure. In part, that's for reasons of espionage, but also because it represents pre-positioning for destructive cyber operations and reflecting that cyber is becoming a tool of power. As a result, there really is every reason for those organizations working on critical infrastructure to be concerned about the cyber threat. Now, the way that I want to go and do this is by focusing in on these case studies. And the case studies I'm going to use are actually all around Russia and Russian government activity. I want to emphasize this isn't because I'm seeking to criticize Russia or to make any political point. However, the harsh reality is that the Russian government does use cyber as a weapon. It understands its importance. And it's been pretty active. And here's a list of some of the cyber incidents which have been attributed to Russia. And the NCSC was involved in a number of these and involved in the attribution. So I'm very confident to say that Russia was responsible for these. And beginning with TV5 in France, which of course was false flagged as being linked to the Islamic State, and the really significant compromise of the Ukrainian power system in 2015, and then again in 2017. And of course not Petra, which had a major impact. But I'm going to try and focus on two case studies: the compromise of the Democratic National Committee in 2016. And so apologies to US listeners who must be heartily sick of this as an issue in the United States at the moment, but I think there's some really important lessons to come out of it. And secondly, the activity against UK, US and other countries' critical infrastructure in 2017 by Russia. So again, I think I've chosen those two particular examples in part because now, for various reasons that I'll go into, there's quite a lot of open source material about these attacks. And this is material which was, until a few months ago, regarded as highly classified. But hopefully it'll give you real insight into how a very competent cyber actor goes about seeking to compromise critical infrastructure. So I'm going to begin with the first case study by looking at one particular part of the Russian military, or sorry, the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, which is known, for those of you who are involved in the cybersecurity research world, as either APT28 or Fancy Bear. And I've chosen them because they are acknowledged to be amongst the most competent cyber organization in the world. They're aggressive and they are highly technically proficient. If you've read the recent Mueller indictment, the Department of Justice indictment of members of the GRU for the hack of the Democratic National Committee, then you'll know it goes into an extraordinary amount of detail about the work of two GRU teams. And that's 26165. Their role is to compromise the network of victims. And then the second team, 74455, their role is to exploit it. And I really do heartily recommend that you read that DOJ indictment. They're normally not that interesting to read, but they contain incredible detail about the workings of these particular groups. And some of the really interesting part about it is that some of that detail has clearly come from the compromise of their own networks. In particular, press speculation that the Dutch intelligence service, the AIVD, had managed to hack into their systems and in some of their cameras, which shows that even the best people in this work are most vulnerable. So this first case study around the DNC is going to focus, as I say, on the GRU. So running through this timeline of the GRU cyber attack on the Democratic National Committee, I need to make a couple of points about events which actually aren't on the timeline. So in September 2015, the DNC commissioned a review of its cybersecurity committee. They used Good Harbor Security Risk Management to have a look at their network. And they in turn came up with some recommendations around hardening the network, introducing two-factor authentication, improving firewalls, etc., etc. And what's fairly typical, and I should emphasize, I go through this talk, I'm not seeking in any way to criticize the DNC. What they did is quite typical, that you have this report, and actually the reality when it comes to implementing it, there's an impact on business, on performance, there's costs. They didn't implement a number of the recommendations, and that was a critical mistake, which really came into impact the following year. The other activity which was happening before this sort of timeline kicked off at the end of 2015, the end of 2016, the GIU, particularly Unit 26165, was repositioning the network that they were going to go and use in preparation for the US election. So they were leasing operational relay boxes, compromising other networks ready to carry out the attack. And interestingly, one of the mistakes they made, and these people do make mistake, is that they reused an operational relay box which had been used in the August 2015 attack on the Bundestag and the German Parliament. So that meant that by early March of 2016, they were ready to go and carry out the attack, and they, as always was often with these attackers, they began by scanning and by open source research, and that open source research is really important for these attackers in terms of giving them a sense of the email attacks, the email addresses that they're going to seek to exploit early and understand the structure of the organization and who matters. The first spear phishing emails were sent out on the 10th of March, and as I flagged up here, one of the emails sent by 26165 was to John Podesta, who's chair of the DNC, to his assistant. And you may not be able to go and see it, may not be very clear, but shown up there is the email, which was claimed to be from Google, saying that the account had been compromised and they would need to change it. Now, one of the key points which comes out of this story is that actually that was John Podesta's personal Gmail account rather than one on the DNC official network. And actually, that's where a lot of the really sensitive information that was subsequently disclosed came from. Over 50,000 emails came from his personal account, as you can then go and see. And there was a lesson there for other chief executives about their use of their personal email and outside of the enterprise. Now, actually, pretty soon after that email was received, and unfortunately the account was compromised, one of John Podesta's aides, Charles Delavan, realized that there was that this was a spear phishing email and alerted John Podesta's assistant, and has been well publicized the very unfortunate spelling mistake in his email. He then refers to the spear phishing and describes this as a legitimate email. Of course, he meant illegitimate email or not legitimate email, but gave instructions for John Podesta to change his password and to ensure that two-factor authentication was on. Unfortunately, nothing was happened. Nothing happened was done about it because people were busy, they were exhausted, and these mistakes happen. And again, as we see as we go through the incidents, there's people at the heart of all of these things. I think it is interesting that the GIU attempted to compromise the accounts actually associated with Hillary Clinton's campaign specific to that, but were unable to because of two-factor authentication. And again, there's a real lesson for us to go and take from that. That email, that spear phishing email against John Podesta was only one small part of what was being done. Based on the open source research, the GIU were able to significantly compromise most of the DNC and the related Democratic Congressional Committees networks. So that in effect, by the end of March, they were in complete control. And in April, they had in effect created a tunnel which allowed them to exfiltrate data through a network of leased computers away and be in a position to be able to exploit it. it wasn't until the end of May that, as a result of a number of different countries and organizations working on this, the DNC were alerted by FBI and also by SecureWorks. And of course, as we became public on the 14th of June, the Clinton campaign made a statement that it had been compromised, and that was pretty quickly the next day followed up by a leak through Guccifer, who is a character completely made up by the GRU, by that second team, 74455, and it was 74455 who arranged for the data to be shared with WikiLeaks and an organization called DC Leaks, which they had created. And the Mueller report goes into some really interesting detail about how they did that, how they paid for it with Bitcoins, etc., etc. I think also to note that whilst the GRU began to sort of cover up pretty much immediately, it wasn't until the end of October 2016 that they were finally removed from both networks. So that's some of the background to what happened, and clearly it had depending on people's political views, which we're not going to go into, may or may not have had an effect on the US election, but it certainly has been controversial as a result. So I'm going to finish with that case study, but I'm now going to go and talk about a second one, which relates to Russian targeting of the UK and the US energy sectors. Now, I say the UK and US energy sectors, actually other countries were impacted, and as Symantec bring out on their slide here, certainly Turkey and Switzerland were affected, but probably a number of other countries were impacted, but they either did not detect it, or they've chosen for whatever reason not to disclose that targeting. The particular bit of the Russian data involved in it are linked to the GRU and to the other Russian agencies. They're known as Energetic Bear, or to some researchers as Dragonfly. But again, very confident this was linked to the Russian state. So the key points about this attack, to say, it involved a number of countries, and there was almost identical activity going on in different countries at different times, which highlights the importance of information sharing between different companies. What really is very significant is the way this was a long-term and developed strategic attack. This was very, very carefully planned, and I'll try and bring that out as I go through the kill chain. It wasn't just directed against the companies themselves, it was also against their supply chain, and it exploited other industries. And as we'll explore at the end, it would appear to be possibly being pre-positioning ready for a destructive attack, and an attack which would have very, very, very big impact on any of the countries concerned. So what I'd like to do now is just to talk you through some aspects of the kill chain. I'm not going to go into that much detail. Again, I would recommend that you read the DHS report that was produced jointly with the NCSC. That goes into quite a lot of technical detail, if that's what you've been interested in. Now, I'm sure many of you who'll be listening to this already aware of it, and may well have read the report and indeed taken action on the base of it, not least from all the IOCs that were the indicators of compromise that were shared. So going through the sort of significant points, so beginning with the reconnaissance, it's very, very clear that they deliberately chose the organizations to target. These were not in any way targets of opportunity. That's reinforced by the fact that Dragonfly actors identified as part of the reconnaissance staging targets that would allow them to get to the main organizations. They used, again, open source, and with some important lessons for organizations about what can be discovered about their networks and their organizations from open source. The example that the DHS quote is how the Dragonfly actors downloaded a photograph from one of the HR page which included a high resolution photograph, which had behind it on as part of the screen control systems, equipment models, and status information, which would have been invaluable to the attackers. So as similar to as we saw with the DNC, they built up this knowledge of where they should go and make the attack. But unlike the DNC, they intended that some of it, because the targets were going to be harder, would be to go via these other stages, via these secondary targets. And they downloaded the source code for several of the intended targets websites and ensured that they were in a position to understand how the email service worked, how VPN connections, etc. worked. So as a result of that reconnaissance, they were then able to move on to the sort of weaponization stage, and that began with spear phishing emails, and they then mounted a spear phishing campaign using email attachments which leveraged Microsoft Office functions and SMB protocols. That was generally pretty successful, but in parallel, I should say it was pretty much successful. They were not able to exploit that despite having valid credentials in areas where there was two-factor authentication applied. The second tactic they used in weaponization was the use of watering hole domains, and they compromised staging targets and used the infrastructure of these organizations to get into the ultimate targets. And so who were these watering holes? Well, as the report brings out, there were trade publications, there were consultants, there were any websites which was related to industrial control systems or critical infrastructure, anywhere that they knew the target organization would have people visiting them. It's quite interesting when the NCSC ended up going to some of these organizations who'd become watering holes. In many cases, there was a real reluctance to accept that they had been compromised because they were worried that what this would mean for their relationship with their clients. And that makes for some really, really difficult decisions. So I want to leap forward to the stage now to exploitation. And we saw the Dragonfly actors using malicious docs to gather credentials to allow them to be in a position to move forward, which they did into the installation stage. And they, having compromised credentials, were able to move laterally and access any of the victims' networks where two-factor or multi-factor authentication was not in place. Again, as the report produces, they were able to maintain persistence both on the staged actors by creating local administrators' accounts, but also on the main actors by creating malicious files within the targets. I think for many of you who are in this audience, I think one of the key points is that they actively looked for administrators and engineers to target. They know that you hold the keys to the system, and they actively went after them. So let's just talk about finally the action on objectives. What were they seeking to do? Well, we saw them looking at industrial control systems, and they were clearly moving into a position where they would, if they wanted to be able to compromise ICS. And I think more generally that what that tells us about ICS is that frequently the compromises that occur are through the wider enterprise. But we still, if I go to that final point on my slide, don't fully understand what this was about, and the views of the research community, the views of the organisations impacted, the views of government. There isn't a clear, but clearly this would have left them in the attackers in a very strong position if they chose it to make a destructive attack rather than just gathering information. So I'm going to I'm going to stop there with that on the case studies, and I'm instead going to go and move on to highlight to you some of the themes that we at the NCSC saw about why organizations are being compromised. Why does it happen? And I'm going to start with the most obvious, which is, I'm afraid that we're getting the basics wrong. Now, I do want to emphasize, I'm not trying to criticize organizations who've been criticized. I've spent 18 months working with them, and I understand that a lot of this stuff is very, very difficult. But that's the harsh reality, is that at least 85% of cyber attacks would be stopped if we got the basics right. So what do I mean by the basics? Well, I'm sure you'll be able to flag these up. But from what we saw, patching, incredibly important. And the NCSC really does recommend aggressive patching to keep up to date with threats. We saw basic failures in network configuration, which allowed attackers to identify easy win opportunities to go and identify networks which they could then come back to. We saw a lot of poor credential management. And critical, again, to this audience, a failure to protect systems administrators. This was very clear that a number of mistakes are being made by system administrators, sending and receiving emails from administrative accounts, surfing the web from an administrative account, all things that we really know that we shouldn't happen, but do, and they're exploited by attackers. And also of critical importance, the poor password policy. Passwords not complex enough, and failure to implement two-factor or multi-factor authentication. Real key themes in terms of the attacks that we saw. Moving on to the next theme, and that's around the complexity of networks. We saw a number of organizations who really didn't understand their own network. And that, again, I'm not being pejorative, it can be very challenging, some very complex organizations. The important thing being, though, to understand what is the data that you really, or the systems that you really, really care about, and are those being properly protected? Do you understand it? Do you understand what risks you're carrying? Do you understand what you need to segment, etc., etc.? Almost became a saying that some organizations are being too complex to be able to defend themselves. The next theme is really important, legacy equipment. And in the NCSC, one of my roles was to go to senior managers within organizations who had been compromised. When we went to network defenders, and we would share with them an IP address that we believe the actors were exploiting, probably 80% of the time, they would come back and say that's from legacy equipment, almost with a sigh of relief. And of course, that isn't actually of any sort of relief, it's just how they've entered the network. And so legacy equipment clearly represents a major risk, particularly if it's not patched. And it should be a priority for being tackled. I should say, as I go through these themes, you'll see that they're all closely related. Over the last couple of years, there's been really an increase in the number of attacks relating to supply chain. As organizations begin harden themselves, the attackers go to their supply chain to be able to go through them. Also of critical importance over the last year has been trusted connections, which clearly came out strongly with the NotPetya attack, which just to remind you all, in 2017, when it was the GRU hijacked a download of Ukrainian tax software and an update and included malware within it, the NotPetya malware. And because of trusted connections international companies had into subsidiaries in Ukraine, they ended up being affected. So clearly the lesson here is about understanding what the trusted connections are and managing those connections. Similar lessons that were learned on WannaCry a few months before. The next theme has really been very strongly felt in the last year, around mergers and acquisitions. A number of the organizations that we dealt with had made a merger. They because of the sensitivity, of course, of the acquisition process, their cyber due diligence had not been part of that process, or just had not been taught about. So as a result, following the merger, you inherit a whole pile of cyber risk that you may not understand an acquisition. Indeed, I was working with a company in the last couple of weeks who, having made a merger and acquisition, have had that exploited by attackers. And it's often made worse because following the acquisition, there's a desire to save money, and the staff who previously looked after that network may be let go, creating a loss of knowledge and also potentially creating an insider threat risk. Often the network that has been inherited contains legacy equipment which is not being tackled, and again the basics, patchings, etc., is simply not done, and it's adding again to the complexity for the network defenders of what they've got to go and do. Another theme is outsourcing, and clearly outsourcing really matters. It really matters to the international community in terms of economically, very, very important, and it allows organizations to be a lot more efficient. However, it also can represent a cyber risk. It can represent a cyber enhancement if the people that you outsource to are really strong on cybersecurity, that you've outsourced to somebody where cybersecurity is taken seriously rather than outsourced to the people who can just do it, produce the lowest possible bid. And certainly, I'm afraid the UK government has been at times, as it would now acknowledge, being guilty of that, where we have not placed a high enough priority on the security arrangements around outsourcing. And this was really brought home in spring of last year, when we worked on a compromise of a number of managed service providers. And really this followed by some really good work by PwC and BAE Systems, who noticed that their clients had been compromised by APT10, which I'm sure you'll be aware is a Chinese intrusion set linked to the Chinese government. And the connection between these different clients seemed to be their managed service provider. And we worked with BAE and PwC and a number of other countries and organizations to investigate this. And of course, we worked with the managed service providers themselves to understand it. And again, as I'm sure you're all aware, a managed service provider is a really attractive target and a high priority target for many actors. It's a very attractive target because it potentially gives you access to a large number of clients. It allows you to compromise and obtain security credentials in Argentina, then to be able to go and move across the world, compromise the clients, and then take out the data through Scandinavia or wherever else you might choose to go and do. And it's highly unlikely that you are going to be spotted by signals intelligence agencies like GCHQ, because it's entirely on private networks. Now, I think there were a number of worrying things which came out of this investigation. We saw that a number of claims that the MSP security teams had detected these issues and, of course, had attempted to mitigate the risks. Unfortunately, generally, they weren't successful. Underestimated their adversaries and overestimated their own capabilities, which I'm afraid is quite a common theme in cyber. Even more worryingly were some of the communication issues between MSPs and their clients. We became aware of MSPs who realized that their clients had been compromised through the MSP's network, but opted not to tell them because it wasn't in the contract. So there's some really, and of course that can lead to a real breakdown in trust. So there's some really important lessons here for those who are using outsourcing to ensure that we have the right contracts in place, the right arrangements and the right assurance for MSPs. And most importantly, that security is a much higher priority within that process. And indeed, as one of the CEOs, one of the MSPs acknowledged, this is an attack on their basic way of working. So it's really important that we get this right, and we also share information across. We can't have a position where it's the lawyers, who are managing all of this. The next reason why organizations are being compromised is around people. It could be around people making mistakes and opening those spear phishing emails. So I think we have to question how much we can really expect members of staff to be able to detect the most sophisticated attacks, but clearly that is something which we should try and address. But it's around mistakes being made, as I flagged up earlier, by systems administrators. And of course, the insider threat, whether it's for ideological reasons like Edward Snowden, or it's somebody who's being paid to seize data, or somebody who will facilitate a technical attack. People represent a risk. And the final category, sorry, and I should have also said on people, there's also something which we've got to look inwards about our own capabilities. Sometimes, how good are our own network defenders? How capable are we? And do we really have the right training? Do we have the right people to be able to go and defend this? So people's a really big factor, I'm afraid, that we saw that there were some network defenders who were out of their depth. So my final one is around making the wrong decisions at whatever level within the organisation, whether, as we saw with the case of DNC, deciding not to implement proposals. That's pretty typical. But we know, the NCSC could offer up designs for organisations which would ensure their complete security, but of course they wouldn't actually be able to do any business. We need to get the right balance between usability of systems, the cost, and the security aspects. They just need to be fully informed decisions, and it all looks very, very different after you've been the victim of a cyber attack, how much you're going to spend on that. So getting the governance right, getting the decision making right, really important. Say a number of occasions we would go to organizations to discover that logging had been switched off because it had an impact on the performance of systems. I now want to move on to talk just very briefly. It's the final thing I'm going to cover, which is trends and predictions looking ahead. So clearly, the capabilities of actors and the cyber tools, they're growing, the number of tools, not helped by leaks of tools from CIA, NSA, etc., which became made available now, can easily be accessed. But it's also, which means that there are just more people. These tools will be becoming available for criminals, a wide range of organizations. The other theme is that we've seen, and we're going to continue to see, more countries using cyber for espionage and influence. You've only got to look at what's happening in the Middle East, the tension between Iran and its neighbours, the destructive attacks that Iran is alleged to have carried out against Saudi Arabia, which evidence of how this is being used. The dispute between Qatar and its neighbours in the Gulf, where again cyber is a weapon. So even more intent to use these weapons. A continued and probably increased blurring between state and non-state actors in certain countries. They benefit from having criminals who provide them with a capability, provide them with information, expertise, and so it's in their interest to protect those actors. So I predict that we're going to see destructive attacks becoming the norm, and unfortunately I think it's going to take a highly destructive attack on the critical infrastructure to really make us to change the way we approach this, so that we're introducing security right from the start. In response, we'll see more attribution, hence why there are these detailed reports like the Mueller report and the DHS thing as a deterrent. And finally, we're going to see more use of offensive cyber. So at this stage, I'm going to go and stop. I'm going to go and hand back to Beyond Trust, to Sarah, and then to Brian Chappell, but I look forward to taking your questions later. Over to you.
Okay, so thank you, John. Brian Chappell here from Beyond Trust. As Sarah mentioned, I spend most of my time talking to customers about how our solutions fit into their environments and how they can best structure their security approaches. And I'm just going to kind of whiz through relatively quickly some of the ways in which we can mitigate some of the threats that John mentioned, in particular, covering some of those elements of the basics. And I think it is a critical thing that, as John said, we need to move toward incorporating security into the fundamental fabric of what we do on a day-to-day basis in our cybersecurity roles. And let's start the kind of looking back at the kind of things John's been talking about and how an attack generally progresses. And this kind of model covers the majority of the attacks that you've seen in the press over the past few years, all the way back to things like Target and beyond even that. So normally we look at an infrastructure, there's an internet connectivity on the outside, we have a lovely infrastructure behind a nice wall or a number of walls that we have put up. And we start with the external actor who exploits generally a vulnerability either on the edge or via a phishing attack on a workstation. They then look for some kind of privilege account, which allows them to move laterally across the network until they find that goodness in the middle of your network, which is all your intellectual property, the things that make you different as an organization. And obviously we need to look at these as things that we need to deal with. But as John said, there's many complex networks out there, and it can be quite difficult to try and decide how you're going to tackle this, especially when there are lots and lots of security firms out there who are all telling you that they're going to solve all of your problems. I work for a security firm. We're quite clear there is no silver bullet. Nothing is going to solve everything. But I want to share with you an approach to kind of slotting things together in a slightly different way that will help you address those things without you needing to take that big bite out of the apple on day one. So if we think about that first point of entry, and whether that's a legacy system, which is quite common in and around ICS, some old system, and we're seeing through NotPetya with versions of Windows 7 not being patched, and even as far back as XP, those systems are critical, but all of the systems that we're looking at have vulnerabilities identified with them, and we need to be dealing with those. And that's one of those basics that we're not doing very well, as John mentioned. So if I share with you this statistic, and this comes from a number of reports between 2011 all the way through to 2016, and this figure hasn't changed dramatically in that time. So 95% of all the successful attacks were the result of well-known and entirely preventable vulnerabilities. And by that I mean these are vulnerabilities that have been published, the exploits have been published, we've known about them for long periods of time, and we should have done something about them. But something about the way we're approaching those vulnerabilities is failing to deliver for us in that space. Of those, 99% of those vulnerabilities, 99.9% of the vulnerabilities were compromised, and this is a shocking figure, more than 1 year after the information was published. And if you look at the last, the 2017, 2016 DBIR reports, they did do a breakdown of the age of the vulnerabilities that have been exploited. And I think in the earlier one, the oldest exploited vulnerability had been discovered in 1999. A year later, the oldest vulnerability was 1998. So again, clear evidence that something about the way we're approaching this just isn't working for us. So let's have a quick think about how we can deal with infrastructure and securing systems and networks and all those sorts of things when dealing with vulnerabilities. Now, most of us tend to look at the severity of our vulnerability. They're ranked from high through medium to low to informational. And we'll start at the highs and we'll start working through them. Makes sense. Those are the ones that we're told by the system are the biggest severity in our environment. But the problem is, this first point says, severity doesn't equal risk. There's two parts to risk. There's the impact and the probability of it happening. We're missing that probability piece. How can we get that probability piece? Well, if we look at the vulnerabilities that have those published exploits that people already know how to break into our networks with, those are inherently the highest risk you can be looking at. The more exploits have been published, the higher the probability that there's a tool out there on the deep web that is readily available, is fully supported, with incredible service levels. I mean, some of these dark web, deep web solutions have actually better service levels than some of the products we get out there from major vendors. But there's more chance that one of those toolkits has got that exploit in there, and somebody can literally just hit a button and be attacking you. That's the area where we need to be focusing. So we need to be looking at tooling that gives us information like exploit count as one of the elements that we should be working with. This is a little screenshot from one of my labs, and it shows you that the second vulnerability I have listed by number of exploits is one related to Oracle databases. That's an informational level vulnerability. In and of itself, not a big issue. But as a foothold in your network to start looking around further, it's fundamentally concerning. And there's 9 pages of vulnerabilities there. I can tell you if I sort them by high, I get to about page 6 before I run out of vulnerabilities. If I sort them by known exploits, I don't get halfway down the second page before there are no more vulnerabilities for me to deal with. And those vulnerabilities, yes, those are the ones that, the NSA reveals showed that state actors are aware of some of them. But actually, for the vast majority of us, that's not where we're going to get hit. We're going to get hit on the easy stuff. For those of you who are critical infrastructure providers, these are still going to be the first things they're going to try. So move yourself off of the easy target list and move yourself into the more difficult work. And at least then you're giving yourself a fighting chance of dealing with these individuals. So once they're in your network, I said they're going to look for some kind of privilege, because the thing they need to do is move off the system that they've come in on. The chances are that first entry point does not have all of the goodness that they're looking for, the stuff that's actually valuable. It's often an end user system. They've clicked on a phishing email, as we saw from the DNC breach, and that's one of those areas in which we need to engage our people better. We don't expect them to be able to detect sophisticated attacks, but we do need them to understand the impact of clicking on something that they're not confident about, or that they just simply haven't thought about. Let's be honest, you send a PDF with urgent sales order to 99% of salespeople, and they're going to click on the PDF before they've read half of the email. But we need to help them understand the impact there. And some of this approach to security that I'll talk about will help us become more positive in the way that we present ourselves to our users. And hopefully you'll get that as a takeaway. So tackling lateral movement. The majority of times we talk about this, we're talking about things like pass the hash, silver tickets, golden tickets, all those kind of mechanisms, particularly under Windows, that allow us to move across the network. And the initial thing we need is some privilege to find some stored hashes on the system that we've come in under, and poor credential management means that hash is still valid within the system after it's been used for the task it was intended. Domain admin accounts not getting changed over periods of time, and those accounts being used to used to log into lots of different systems. Once I have that hash, I'm literally bouncing across your network as a fully authorized member of your network. Very hard to pick up in your monitoring. So how do they do it? Unfortunately, stolen credentials still actually form a relatively important part. One of the last reports I read on this still had it somewhere in the order of 12% of attacks involved some kind of stolen or purchased credential. If your user has some kind of privilege on their account that allows them access to the operating system, then that's going to be an opportunity for those credentials to be useful. I mentioned pass the hash, gold and silver tickets, where I can literally create my own hashes to move across the network. Unchanged passwords facilitating that, and reuse of those passwords across systems. I mean, those are just fundamental things that we need to get better at. And like John, I'm not looking to point fingers at anybody here. Anyone who's in the situation who's feeling that somehow they're unusual, do not feel that way. We've all been guilty of this, and you would be amazed at how many people are still struggling with these things. As security professionals, we have a really hard job to do, and sometimes it's hard to get through the massive data that comes at us every day to know exactly what we should be doing. We need to kind of take a step back and look at refining those basics so that everything that's built on top of it will be more practical and inherently better for us. So how do we gain control? Well, let's control and monitor the access to our privileged accounts. Gartner call it privileged password management. Some people call it privileged access management. It's got a variety of names, but getting some tool in there that's going to broker the access into those privileged accounts so that nobody has the passwords, nobody gets to access those credentials directly, and we have the opportunity to maintain the control and monitor what's going on with those accounts while they're being used. This can be really useful with MSP kind of environments because somebody can only connect into that system, and that system then connects onto the target machine. So somebody on the outside never gets the opportunity to connect directly to the target machines. So you help mitigate some of that risk of allowing third parties into your environment to administer your systems. And the account passwords themselves, you know, when we've got like local admin or root across our Linux machines, let's make sure that every instance of that account has an entirely different password. Let's make sure that password is OS maximum length and maximum complexity. Let's change it every time it's being used. Now, if one machine is compromised, the hash on that machine is now no longer valid for lateral movement because it won't be authenticated against either the local machine or, if it's a domain account, against the domain, because the hash does not match the hash that's being stored now because the password's been changed. And even if we're not using these accounts, let's change them periodically so that we don't get stale passwords sitting out there, because that's what the brute forcer wants. He wants a password that's going to remain the same and they're going to have a chance to attack it. I mean, some recent stats kind of indicated that, you know, once you start getting up into the 10, 12, 16 character passwords, it actually takes longer than the age of the universe to crack using current technologies, quantum, you know, to one side. But even that, I think, will have some difficulties once you start getting up into the 60, 80 character passwords with maximum complexity. And the thing is, as you're changing that password, if somebody is trying to brute force your passwords, the longer they're checking, the more likely it is the password's now something they've already checked. So incredible value that comes from these systems, but relatively easy to implement because it's a point access. Your users come to that point and then they can access all those systems beyond them. Here's a very simple screen off of our password safe tool showing you the ability to define different access policies as you go towards those systems. So you can give different groups different access to different or the same groups of accounts. You can have that kind of control very easily and very quickly. Nice, simple win. Here's my dream for your networks. Every user is a standard user, even the admins. Now, if we think about networks, we're told about admins and users. There generally isn't that much in between. Windows has a whole pile of operators who are there for specific tasks. But generally speaking, the idea is there are admins who look after it and users who use it. But the moment someone needs to install something, that gets broken, or somebody needs to run a particular tool. Ideally, we want everybody as a standard user, and this is achievable. And what we're doing is we're going to implement what's known as the principle of least privilege. And here's the earliest reference I can find to it. So Jerome Salzer here, who was one of the architects of the Multics operating system, which is the kind of father to Unix and Linux, he said this in 1974. I kind of paraphrase this in saying that every program and every privileged user of the system should operate using the least amount of privilege necessary to be productive. And this is a fundamentally important thing when we're dealing with security. And one of the reasons I think, you know, we don't have the greatest relationship with our customers or internal users, and we don't have their buy-in with us as a security team, because generally we're the people who say no. Generally we're the people who they end up phoning us and going, I can't do my job because of this new tool you've put in my way. We need to make sure that when we're looking at these kind of tools, we are as transparent to the user as possible. And so when we're looking at least privilege, we are enabling them to do all of the things that they need to do, but we're not giving them full admin privilege to the system. And the approach to this is to target the applications, because generally speaking, your user didn't wake up this morning and go, hi, I think I want to be an admin today. They came into the office, they clicked on something, they were told they needed admin or higher privileges than they currently had. So it's not the user who actually needs the privilege. They only need it to give it to the application that's running so the application can run as it needs. So if we target the application, oh, I seem to have missed a slide there. If we actually target the application itself, because they drive the need for the privilege, we can target the application's privileges, not the users. And I would say across the majority of your networks, there's going to be less than 10% of the applications that are being run that actually need some kind of privilege. And what's nice is once you've established what that privilege is, and there's tooling to help you, we supply it as a number of the vendors, once you've established what that privilege level is, it doesn't change very often. So there's an initial piece of analysis and work to be done to find out what needs to be elevated and what that elevation level is. But once you've got that, you can now do that least privilege. I can say that, John's in development, so he needs to run Visual Studio. He needs the debug programs capability so that he can actually hook his debugger onto the code so that he can work through and fix bugs. Or I need to allow them to run the IIS management tool on their system or on a development system so that they can manipulate the web site settings for new code that they're uploading. Because we're there at the point that the application is being launched, we're manipulating the privileges, and we do this entirely within the operating system. There's no shenanigans going on here. It's entirely legitimate. Microsoft were fully with us as we developed this. We're also able to do things like stop applications from running, or we can compare the application to our vulnerability database. Advantage of us being involved in privilege and vulnerability. We can actually do some compliance and risk enforcement at the point the application is launched. But the thing is, the fundamentally important thing here is that we've gone from trying to lock down what an administrator can do, which is an implicit security model, implicitly they have all privileges, to actually moving to an explicit security model, which means we have many fewer things to consider. So for each group of users, they can run this application, this application, and this application with only the privilege needed for those apps to actually work as they should. That then changes our model. Because we can be application specific as well, we've also got the opportunity to say yes to our users far more often. You need Adobe Acrobat. Here's the capability to install Adobe Acrobat. And I'm not just going to give it to them for an hour or a day. There's no need. If they're going to be able to run Adobe Acrobat as part of their role, I can leave that capability with them because I know that's all it gives them. And monitoring wise, I'm not concerned about other things they could do with this privilege because there is no other thing that they can do with this privilege. So all of your SIEM systems and your other monitoring tools actually become more valuable and more powerful because we've literally also taken the noise out of the system. So when someone's seen directly using some kind of admin privilege in a space that they shouldn't, that doesn't link up with what you've seen from the other tooling, you've got a clear signal of malfeasance or some ill-doing going on within the environment. So if we look at this and now think about what we've achieved, what we've put in is we've put in a number of layers, as I would describe them, and I think of them in terms of an onion. If you hold up a layer of an onion, you can almost see through it. I don't mean the kind of thick segments, but an individual skin. And each user should only be interacting with one or two layers. But when we try and look from the outside of the onion to the center of the onion, it becomes opaque. Those simple layers add up to make a formidable barrier. So if we think of those points we saw in that first diagram about how the network is protected, so we have our edge, we have our initial shared passwords, we have individual privilege as three kind of layers we can deal with very quickly. Suddenly we find this was the intrusion we saw. So let's track back. So we've taken away users with privileged accounts. So we've knocked off one of the opportunities to move laterally. We've taken control of the shared accounts, shared privileged accounts from our environment. We're rotating them. We're making sure they're all different. We've stopped past the hash and those similar kind of attacks. So lateral movement's really been nailed down here. And we've dealt with the vulnerabilities, which are the low-hanging fruit first. We've got the biggest bang for our buck. Suddenly, with 3 relatively simple layers, we have mitigated the vast majority of the possible attacks that can come toward us. Now our security teams have the bandwidth, they have the brain space, and they have the time, certainly as a critical infrastructure provider, to deal with those more targeted attacks, those more persistent threats that exist out there. We can actually address those because we're not firefighting all the time, because we've got control. And at this point, we're really in the position to be able to make security part of the fabric of our infrastructure. And we can turn that red circle in the middle to a green circle because we can feel confident that we've done everything necessary to secure our environment. Now, as John will probably agree, we're never going to be 100% secure, and we have to agree, we have to accept that. That's why we should never just rely on one layer. It's about being difficult for the hacker, sending them down blind alleys, making their lives more difficult. So hopefully they'll try somewhere else. And the more time they're trying other things, the more time we have to detect and respond to them. So just as a final thing for me, if we're better at the basics, we can do that by targeting the biggest risks first, those vulnerabilities with known exploits. We can control the access to shared privileged accounts within our environment. We can enforce password hygiene to make sure these accounts have got passwords being rotated regularly. We can do it with users as well to move up their password complexity, taking the recent advice from the NIS of using one long, complicated password and not forcing the users to change it regularly, making it difficult enough that a brute force hack isn't going to find it. It also means they've only got one password to remember. And we also lift responsibility from our sysadmins by enabling them to do more without needing to firefight continually. We're going to get more value out of our teams through that route. And you won't end up with people putting passwords on post-it notes on screens, or as I saw in one organization, actually hanging it from a board in the middle of the room so everybody could see it. I walked in and gave them the password because I saw it from the window outside. From Beyond Trust perspective, this is what our infrastructure looks like. These are the kind of areas in which we can help you. We can help you with those shared passwords. We can help you with endpoint least privilege and server privilege. We also have vulnerability management, all on the same platform of Beyond Insight, as we call it. And we utilize all of these tools together to provide you with a more coherent view across your infrastructure. But it is a situation where you can start in one place and evolve into another. The tools don't force you down one view of best practice. They allow you to implement your best practice or your version of best practice. And that's fundamentally important, allow you to grow in that space. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to hand back to Sarah now, who's just got 1 or 2 last things for you.
Yes, thank you so much, Brian. I know so much to cover, but if you would like to schedule a personalized one-on-one demo or a deeper conversation with us about any of our PAM products or even our Retina vulnerability management solution, please select yes. Somebody will be in contact with you to schedule that conversation and to set up that demo. There's a lot to show you guys, a lot to talk about, and we want to help you secure. So select yes, and we will be in contact with you. Let's just jump in. I know we're a little bit late, but let's just jump into a couple of questions while this poll is up, and then we'll wrap it up. John, just make sure you're off of mute, and we had a question come in for you. So what other technologies should network defenders consider employing?
So I think we've talked quite a lot about spear phishing emails. I think there's some really interesting work going around deep packet inspection on email attachments. There's a couple of organizations, UK companies, Deep Secure, Glasswall Solutions. They're doing some really exciting stuff about making those, giving more assurance to people that if they do open that email attachment, it's not going to be malicious. So I think that's really exciting because I think there's some real limitations around what we can realistically train people to do.
Last question for you, John. Aren't the attackers always going to get through?
I think it's really, as Brian said at the end, that actually you can take some relatively, small steps, and you can make it a lot more difficult for the attackers. If there's things which can be done to frustrate, some of the best people in the world, they are going to stop the vast majority. And the reality is you want them to go on to somebody else.
Okay, folks, it's time to wrap up. Be on the lookout for the post-webinar email containing links to the recording and the slides within 2 business days from now. A big thanks to our experts, John and Brian, and to all who attended live. Have a wonderful rest of your day, you guys. We'll see you at the next one. Take care and goodbye.